Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya, who is still in Greece. Good morning, Adefemi.
Good morning, Dr. Rubin. Good morning, Vimbai, and good morning, Rufai. Hope you're all doing well.
Yeah, we're doing all right.
Not as good as you, but we're trying. Wonderful. Hey, no worries, no worries. We're all enjoying the sun today, aren't we?
Yeah.
But first, let me tell you what's happening around the world. We begin in the United Kingdom, where the British that it will officially recognize Palestine as a state. That's unless two very specific solutions. So the first one is that Israel must adhere to a lasting ceasefire. And the second, Israel must commit to a two-state solution. Now, this is quite significant because British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and his cabinet clearly have unveiled their roadmap to peace in the Middle East. It's so serious that Prime Minister Keir Starmer did in fact call members of his cabinet plan, recalling them from their summer break. This is immediately after Keir Starmer met with Donald Trump, the US president, in Scotland, which does suggest that perhaps there was some form of a blessing given from the United States to the United Kingdom for them to make this admission. Now, officially speaking, we do know that out of the White House, officially speaking, that the United States remains staunchly behind Israel and has already condemned the move that France made earlier this month to the same vein, announcing that it was going to officially recognize Palestine as a state in September at the UN General Assembly. But we do see, perhaps this is Donald Trump specifically, perhaps warming to the idea of more countries following suit. Now, this is quite interesting because we do know officially the White House, for example, did say that France making this declaration didn't really carry weight. But this now is two members of the UN Security Council, France and the United Kingdom, throwing its weight behind recognizing Palestine as an official state. Now, when we're looking at Keir Starmer specifically, this is significant because it just shows that Keir Starmer has been facing a lot of pressure, not just from the British people and the British electorate, but also from within his own party. And this is largely due to the mass starvation and the humanitarian crisis that we've been seeing in Gaza. In the background, of course, it's the violence that we're seeing perpetrated by Israel, but clearly this is a change in tune from very significant powers in the quote-unquote Western world that are now clearly doing what they can to show that what Israel has done or is doing to Palestine, to Gaza, is going far too far. Just to put these things into context, we do know that Israel is not happy with France and, of course, the United Kingdom coming out to make these declarations. And they say that this is an example of France and the United Kingdom warning and rewarding Hamas actually for bad behavior. But we do know that when we're looking at the 22 months of war in the Middle East, some 60,000 people have been killed by Israel. And as we've been seeing, as we've been reporting, the mass starvation, the hunger, the lack of aid reaching the people is getting to a point where the world cannot ignore. But just to address what Israel had to say, accusing the United Kingdom of rewarding Hamas, this is what Keir Starmer had to say in response.
To the terrorists of Hamas is unchanged and unequivocal. They must immediately release all of the hostages, sign up to a ceasefire, disarm, and accept that they will play no part in the government of Gaza.
So very significant news happening there. But let's move on now to the African continent. And, you know, he did say that he was not going to throw his hat into the ring, but I think many people have already guessed what was one of Ivory Coast's worst kept secrets, which is essentially its president, Alassane Ouattara, has announced his bid to run for president in Ivory Coast for the fourth time. Now, this is significant because Ouattara is 83 years old and he announced his bid on television on Tuesday, again confirming what many people had already suspected was going to happen. Now, he is now going to be running for the fourth time. This is a move that is only possible because Ouattara changed the Ivorian constitution back in 2016, which would allow him to reset his time in office. His term should have ended in 2020, but when he changed the constitution, it allowed him to run for another 2 times. So we're seeing that if his bid is successful, he would be president for a 4th time. Naturally, we all know that many opposition voices in Ivory Coast have condemned this move and says that this is not something that should happen, that his presidential term should have ended in 2020 under the former constitution. And when we break it down and look at one of his most staunchest rivals, that is, of course, the former Credit Suisse banker and executive Tidjane Thiam, he was legally barred from running in this election because the Ivorian court said that he had 2 nationalities, his Ivorian nationality and a French nationality, at the time where he declared his intention to run. Now, we do know that Thiam has denounced his French and cancelled his French nationality, essentially, and he did so that he could be eligible to run, but that continues to be a situation for him. And for many people who are in the opposition in Ivory Coast, they are not happy with this situation taking place. Now, when we go back to Ouattara himself, he has been president since 2011. He himself is also a former banker, an international banker, and he's also a US-trained economist. It's this backing that many people say have allowed him to really as a savvy technocrat at the helm of Ivory Coast. And when we're looking at the numbers it might not be too far to say that perhaps he has done, quote unquote, a good job with some parts of the Ivorian economy. We're projecting Ivory Coast GDP growth of 6.3% this year, which is matching the average of the past decade, which suggests a level of stability while Ouattara has been president. But clearly this is against the confines of democracy. This is not what many people in the country want. Looking at the politics of it all, there's also the legitimate fear of electoral violence. Let's cast our minds back to when Ouattara went up against Laurent Gbagbo and defeated him in 2010. That sparked a very serious civil war in Ivory Coast that killed 3,000 people. And 2020, when the president won 94.27% of the vote, opposition's did boycott that vote en masse, but he did win quite a of the electorate. And we do know that even then 85 people were killed in the violence thereafter. So this is very much a serious situation that we're seeing happening in Africa. Another example of, as you've called it, as Dr. Rubin calls it, African sit-tightism. It is happening and rearing its head again in Ivory Coast. The country will go ahead for its presidential election on Saturday, the 20th of October. And finally, still staying on the African continent, let's go over to the Central African country of Angola, where 4 people have been killed, 500 others arrested, as people are protesting against a hike in fuel prices. Now, what we're seeing in Angola is essentially the unrest did start out as a 3-day strike by taxi drivers who are demonstrating against the government's decision to raise the price of diesel by 33% earlier this month as part of plans to remove fuel subsidies. Now, that should ring a lot of alarm bells for many Nigerians. We're seeing the same happening in Angola. Now, that move not only meant higher fares for taxi rides, but also food in Angola is also jumping up because many people are obviously going to be fronting the cost of the price of food, especially since you have producers who are transporting food by road. They're transferring those extra costs onto the consumer. So that's why we're seeing mass protests, looting, and a lot of unrest on the streets of Angola. Now, the president, João Lourenço, says that protesters are using the petrol price increase as an excuse to try and undermine his government. But we do know that the average monthly wage in Angola is 70,000 kwanzas. That's approximately $75, which is around just under 115,000 naira every month. Angolan government did say that it was going to raise the minimum wage in Angola to from 70,000 kwanzas to 100,000, but that still hasn't happened. And we're seeing that the unrest will continue. The MPLA, which is the ruling party, has been in charge of affairs in Angola for nearly 50 years. And many people say the state-run media, which did not report on these protests at all, are not doing a good job of representing all of what is happening in Angola. As of Tuesday afternoon, major shops, banks, and private businesses remained closed. Those are your stories. Love to hear your thoughts before we move on to the papers.
I mean, Femi, I'll quickly put out two quotes. Frantz Fanon, oppressed people will always oppress others. Exactly what is happening across these three stories you brought forward. The same Jewish people we spoke for when Hitler oppressed them have now become the oppressors in Gaza. A lot of people say, Rufai, you don't condemn Hamas. I have condemned Hamas. Hamas is a terrible, devilish, bad group. But is Hamas also in West Bank, where Israel is killing citizens in West Bank and taking their land? No. So this one is just about Netanyahu and his fire and fury against the people of Gaza, making them suffer with groups like GHR. That's what they're doing. And they're killing a lot of people, over 60,000 people now. I'm happy the UK, that were part of the problem at first, with the Balfour Declaration, are now saying they'll recognize a Palestinian state, which they should do. In fact, yesterday I had seen the story early on in Novaya Gazeta, and TASS, the Russians, had picked up the story before Keir Starmer did announce it. So you can see the oppressed people of yesteryears, the Jewish people that we all spoke for, are now the ones oppressing people in Gaza. Just like what is happening in Ivory Coast. The same Alassane Ouattara that the world had sympathy for and said Laurent Gbagbo was the problem. Laurent Gbagbo even went to international court in The Hague. Ouattara is now becoming a C-type person because of his own selfish interest. Femi, Ouattara wanted to leave in 2020. Gan Coulibaly was already selected as the man to inherit the position. But guess what happened? Gan died. Once Gan died, Ouattara said, I will run. He ran. Afterwards, he wanted to leave the second time. Hamid Bakayoko was also tipped at some point. Hamid Bakayoko died. He said, I will run. So as long as Ouattara doesn't get a private successor, it is always about Ouattara's interest, not the Ivorian interest. And another person he will have picked, Patrick Ashi. Patrick Ashi, he cannot pick Patrick Ashi because Patrick Ashi served as a minister in Laurent Gbagbo's government. So he doesn't trust Patrick Ashi. So as long as he doesn't trust anybody, then he will keep running. He wants to go and do how many years now? Exactly also what is happening in Angola and the MPLA. So oppressed people will always oppress others. And that's exactly the true nature of Africa and the world at large.
All right, I'll quickly go to Angola, since that's a scenario that mirrors some of the issues that we contend with here, around fuel subsidy. In Angola's case, it's said that the removal of fuel subsidy will free up about $3 billion for the Angolan economy, which is the health and education budget combined. Now, what I find quite interesting about the Angolan case is because here in Nigeria, when we discuss and debate fuel subsidy, there's the debate about shock therapy versus gradualism. Angola has practiced gradualism with regards to removing fuel subsidy. They've been removing subsidy according to different percentages over the past couple of years. And unfortunately, it seems that no matter whether you do the shock therapy or the gradualism, it looks like the impact on the ordinary person, especially the most vulnerable, is always this. And this is especially when we see that the government is not making the commensurate effort to create those security nets, to give that social spending that we continue to talk about. And these are the issues here. These were supposed to be taxi drivers who were protesting, and it's now turned into a bigger opposition movement, if I may call it that, against the MPLA. Now, the MPLA just left the Liberation Movement Summit that was hosted in South Africa over the weekend, where the various liberation movements in the region came together to try and ask themselves, where are we getting it wrong, and why is it that our people are falling out of love with us? Well, I think it's a very difficult time for African liberation movements because they came up and they became populist because of socialist-driven agendas and policies, and now they're being forced to go into a more of a neoliberal school of thought, and it's not translating. They're failing
besides lining their pockets, because if you saw some of the placards in Angola, they were saying, who drank our oil? Angola being like Nigeria, generating most of its foreign currency revenue, over 90% from oil. So there are a lot of similarities in these two instances. How will the Angolan government address this? I'm quite curious to see how they will do so. Then very quickly to Ivory Coast. There was uproar when there were coups, whether it be Burkina Faso or Niger and so forth. ECOWAS spoke. But we are seeing that ECOWAS seems to be a little bit more silent when we see these types of pushbacks to the democratic order. Well, some might say that, well, the constitutional amendment went through a democratic process, and he did go through the moves of democracy to ensure that presidential term limits were removed. So he is within his constitutional right to embark on a fourth term. However, we know that this goes against the spirit of democracy. So for me, I'm quite interested to see how ECOWAS will respond, especially now under new leadership within the region.
Well, the question to ask with regard to Cote d'Ivoire is whether ECOWAS. In the Constitutive Act of ECOWAS, there is this emphasis on democratic transition of power and the rule of law. But we find increasingly in West Africa the fact that our leaders do not respect the constitutions of their country or the rule of law. Togo, Faure Gnassingbé, had to adjust the constitution to give himself an extension in office. Alassane Ouattara in 2016 also abolished constitutional term limit. Adam Barrow in Gambia, who came to power on the back of solidarity against the attempt by Yahya Jammeh to remain in power, is now using the same constitution of 2017 that was put in place by Yahya Jammeh to perpetuate himself in power for a third term. In Guinea-Bissau, where Obaro Embalo is also trying to perpetuate himself in power in December. So there's a crisis in terms of legitimacy and rule of law across West Africa. And it is unfortunate that this is so, because it raises questions about ECOWAS itself. Now, in the case of Alassane Ouattara, he has been in power since 1990. He was a minister first, prime minister. And then in 2010, he became the president, and he wants to remain there. He's following in the footsteps of Teodoro Obiang Mbasogo of Equatorial Guinea, Yoweri Museveni of Uganda, and Paul Biya of Cameroon. These sit-tight leaders, including Paul Kagame of Rwanda. He says, well, he has the experience and that Cote d'Ivoire is facing crisis with security, with economy, and he has done very well raising the economic GDP growth to 6.3% perpetually in a country of 32.7 million people. Is Alassane Ouattara the only person? However, the fear is that, elections in Cote d'Ivoire are fraught with tension and violence. We just hope that that election in October will not break out into violence, particularly as people of Cote d'Ivoire are not pleased with how Tidjane Thiam has been treated. Now, about Angola, the issue about Angola is how these commodity-rich states are unable to fulfill the expectations of their people. In 2023, Angola decided to reduce subsidy. Even then, there were protests. And this time around, there are protests. Because the cost of living has gone up, people who live in commodity-rich nations, including Nigeria, have expectations. And when those expectations are not met, they express their frustration. That's what is happening in Angola. Finally, the issue you raised about UK. Now, the UK says in September, if Israel does not stop the war in the Gaza Strip, then, of course, when they have the General Assembly of the UN in September, it will have no option but to recognize Palestine. The Scottish First Minister made an intelligent point. The minister was saying that, look, it should not be conditional. That, in fact, the UK should be saying there will be sanctions if Israel does not immediately stop the war. However, the issue is about the two-state solution, which has been on the table since the Peel Commission of 1937. And then, of course, subsequently, the 1947 resolution by the UN, the 1948 creation of Israel. In 1952, the Palestinians at the Arab Summit agreed to the two-state solution. Israel also subsequently agreed, but by 2017, Hamas said they should return to the 1967 situation, whereby the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem should be part of the Palestinian state. However, 147 out of the 193 states of the United Nations recognize Palestine. It's only Japan, UK previously, US, France changed its mind in September, who have not yet recognized, that. But I think what is important is the emphasis on addressing the humanitarian crisis and defending the status of international law, which Israel and the United States continue to violate, with Trump saying it will not follow France and UK, and Netanyahu saying nothing is going to change, that, this is the crisis we face, the inequality and the non-observance of international rules and obligations.
Well, thank you all. All righty. Well, thank you all for your submissions. Let's move on to the papers, as of course these 2027 elections continue to approach. Now, from the northern part of the country, we do know that the president has deployed over 60 top government officials, including ministers, heads of security agencies, advisors, heads of parastatals, amongst others, to address the grievances of the north. This is significant because we know that the north of Nigeria represents 2/3 of the population, 3/4 of Nigeria's landmass, and 64% of the votes in favor of President Tinubu at the last election. Very quickly, let's move on to the New Telegraph, which leads with the Independent National Electoral Commission admitting the quality of elections at the local level is still challenging. Now, INEC goes on to say the planned Rivers Council election is a violation of law, just an example of the difficulty INEC is facing. The New Telegraph also reports that the founder and national chairman of the African Democratic Congress, Ralph Nwosu, says the party turned down billions of naira aimed at getting it to abandon its role in Nigeria's opposition coalition. Nwosu made this revelation on Tuesday during the party's National Executive Committee meeting over in Abuja. Now, the politics of northern Nigeria is discussed across a group of Nigerian papers this morning, including The Punch, which says that the power rotation debate is heating up as the North reviews President Tinubu's scorecard. Now, the Daily Trust, the Leadership, and the Daily Sun are all following in on the same tune. Let's head over to the Daily Independent, which has news of the Senate giving the NNPCL 3 weeks, again extending its deadline to explain the whereabouts of this 210 trillion naira that was accounted for on the corporation's books. And the Guardian leads with the electricity distribution companies overbilling 2 million customers, as they say they're struggling with metering and efficiencies as the discos rely more on subsidies from the federal government and customer reclassification into Band A. There's also news of a very disturbing story out of Ondo State, just to the top of the Guardian there, where a police officer's son is believed to have beaten and beheaded his own teenage brother, but then before he himself was then beaten by a mob and died thereafter. So very disturbing news coming out of Ondo. And then finally, the Daily Times this morning, its picture headline does show Vice President Kashim Shettima sat between the United Nations Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed and the CEO of the African Development Agency, who is Nardos Bekele Thompson, during the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The federal government, also on the front page of the Daily Times, is condemning anti-Nigeria protests that have been taking place in Ghana and is trying to avoid any type of reprisal attacks. Those are your papers. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Femi. We really appreciate you for your time.